We look at them and they seem eternal. Gray giants of stone built into the English hills. The Tower, Dover, Kenilworth. Symbols of enduring power and romantic legends. We imagine knights in shining armor and ladies in velvet, feasting in dense halls to the sound of the lute. But this is just a facade, the glossy cover of a book written in blood, sweat, and icy horror. What if I told you that the main battle in these castles was not fought at the walls but inside them? That the real enemy was invisible, silent, and penetrated through 2-meter-high walls? That enemy is the environment itself. Cold, damp, darkness, disease, and despair. We think we know how they survived. Wearing furs, burning fires, eating hot soup. That's true, but only a small part of it. It's like describing the workings of a clockwork, only mentioning the movement of the hands. True survival in an English castle is a mystery we are only beginning to unravel. It is a story of hidden technology, lost knowledge, and psychological resilience that boggles the mind. Forget everything you knew about medieval life. We're not going to talk about how cold it was. We're going to talk about how they created warmth where there seemed to be none. This is not a story of suffering. It's a story about the sophisticated intelligence hidden in the stone. Watch this video to the end and the walls of ancient castles will speak to you in the language of forgotten secrets. The first mystery of the castle is its walls. All we see in them is dead, cold stone, an enemy that absorbs the dank English dampness in the fall and gives it its icy breath all winter long. That's true, but only partly. Medieval builders, especially the Normans who brought their technology to England, knew the secret of stone. They knew how to make it work for themselves, turning a passive mass into an active element of life support. The key is lime whitewash. To us, it's just cheap paint, a way to make the walls look tidy. For the castle dweller, it was a high-tech membrane, the first line of defense against the invisible enemy, moisture. The walls of most English castles were not bare. They were covered with a thick, several layers of lime mortar. And it wasn't about beauty, it was about survival. The process of creating this membrane was a technology in itself. Limestone, calcium carbonate, was fired in special kilns at about 900 degrees to expel carbon dioxide. The result was quicklime, or kipelka, calcium oxide, a caustic and unstable substance. Then it was quenched with water in special pits. The reaction was violent, with the release of a huge amount of heat and steam. The resulting product, slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, was the basis for plaster and whitewash. Lime has unique properties. First, it is a powerful antiseptic. In a world where they didn't know about germs but were constantly faced with mold, fungus, and disease, lime whitewash literally disinfected interior spaces. Its high alkalinity, pH around 12.5, created an environment in which most bacteria and fungal spores simply could not survive. It killed mold spores that loved to settle in the pores of damp stone and prevented the rotting of wooden floor beams, tapestries, and furniture frames. The annals of monasteries often record the purchase of lime to cleanse the chambers after outbreaks of disease or for annual sanitization. It was medieval dry cleaning and disinfection in one bottle. Secondly, and most surprisingly, lime breathes. It is hygroscopic. That is, it is able to absorb excess moisture from the air when the room is too damp, e.g. from the breathing of many people, steam from cooking, or simply in rainy weather, and give it back when the air becomes too dry. The lime-covered wall was turning into a giant passive microclimate regulator. It prevented dampness from condensing on the surface into rivulets of icy water. It absorbed it and then slowly evaporated it. This process involved a slow chemical reaction. Wet calcium hydroxide applied to the wall reacted with carbon dioxide from the air, gradually turning back into hard and durable calcium carbonate. This process, called carbonization, could take months or years, and during it the wall literally breathed, taking in and giving back water molecules. Archaeologists examining the layers on the walls of Rochester Castle have found up to 20 layers of such whitewash, applied one on top of the other over the centuries. It was an annual ritual, vital to maintaining the health of the castle, like a general cleaning and repair at the same time. Moreover, color mattered. The snow-white walls not only made the dark rooms, lit only by the narrow battlement windows, brighter. They worked like giant reflectors, reflecting precious light from expensive beeswax candles or cheaper but smoky tallow sticks and torches. This saved money on lighting and made life in the castle a little less gloomy. But there was also a psychological component. White was associated with purity, light, and divine presence, creating a sense of safety in a confined, hostile space. Surviving meant not only staying warm, but also not going insane in the perpetual darkness and claustrophobia. The white wall was a beacon of this inner light. Sometimes simple patterns were applied over a white background. For example, red ochre was used to draw lines imitating perfect stonework, or simple plant patterns, adding color and life to the interior. So the cold stone wasn't just an enemy, it was a partner in a complex system. Builders chose porous types of stone, like the famous Caen stone from Normandy, which worked well with lime. They were creating not just a fortress, but a living organism that breathed, protected itself from mold, and regulated humidity. It was the first and most unobvious survival technology. The irony of which is that today, in the era of smart homes, we are rediscovering breathable building materials, forgetting the lessons of our ancestors. We can't feel it, but if we were transported to a medieval castle, the first thing that would hit us is the smell. Not just unpleasant, an aggressive, pervasive, thick cocktail of unwashed bodies, smoke from hearths without chimneys, straw rotting on the floor, kitchen smells, animals, dogs, hawks, excrement, and the pervasive odor of fear and damp. Surviving it meant more than just getting used to it. It meant waging a daily war against the miasmas, which were then believed to bring disease and death. This war was subtle and scientific, a real alchemy of smell, and the main weapon was not expensive Oriental incense, but ordinary herbs. The floors of castles were not just covered with straw for warmth. It was a complex, multi-layered carpet of specially selected plants. The process was called strewing, and it was a whole science. The bottom layer was usually reeds, rushes, or cattails. They created a resilient, thick, up to several tens of centimeters, and breathable base that provided a kind of insulation from the cold stone floor. But the top layer changed depending on the season, holiday, and the purpose of the room. In summer, it was fresh grass and fragrant flowers, lavender, chamomile, tavolga, one of the most popular scents, rose, and mint. They not only masked the stench, but also repelled insects, fleas, lice, and flies, the main carriers of infection. In winter, the composition was changed. They used dry herbs with a strong, pungent odor: wormwood, sawdust, thyme, rosemary, hyssop. These plants are not just flavorings. Many of them are powerful insecticides and antiseptics. For example, wormwood and dogwood contain donjon, which is toxic to insects. Thyme and rosemary are rich in essential oils, with proven antibacterial and antiviral properties. By spreading them on the floor, people, without knowing it themselves, were having a session of phytotherapy and disinfection. When these herbs were walked on, they would break down, releasing a new batch of volatile substances. It was a system with prolonged action. In the financial records of Beaumaris Castle in Wales, there are regular records of the purchase of herbs to sprinkle on the Lord's chambers. This was not a whim, but an item of expenditure for security and health. However, there was a downside to this system. The humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam, visiting England in the early 16th century, wrote with disgust that the lower layers of these grasses were rarely changed, sometimes for years. They absorbed spittle, vomit, the urine of dogs and men, spilled beer and the remains of fish, and every other abomination. This rotting mass became a breeding ground for contagion. The perfect system only worked if it was replaced regularly, which was not available to everyone and not always. Besides floors, herbs were used everywhere. Bags of dried lavender and wormwood were sewn into mattresses and pillows, stuffed with straw or wool to deter bedbugs and lice. Bundles of fragrant herbs were hung from ceiling beams so that their scent would spread slowly through the room. They were thrown into the fire so that the smoke would fumigate the room, acting as a fumigator. Ladies wore pomanders around their necks or belts, open-work balls of metal with a lump of ambergris, musk or wax mixed with spices and herbs inside. When walking, the pomander emitted a fragrance, creating a personal cloud of purity around the wearer. During plague epidemics, doctors wore the famous masks with beaks stuffed with just such herbs, juniper, cloves, rosemary, believing they filtered the sick air. It was a struggle not only for physical health, but also for mental health. Modern research proves that fragrances directly affect our mood and cognitive functions. The smell of rosemary improves concentration, while lavender is calming. With constant stress, darkness, and claustrophobia, these scents were the anchors that kept the psyche from derailing. They created the illusion of a summer meadow or a blooming garden in the middle of an icy stone bag. Thus, fighting the odor was not a matter of squeamishness. It was a complex, elaborate survival strategy based on centuries of observations of plant properties. It was an invisible line of defense that protected against disease, insects, and despair, as well as stone walls protected against enemy arrows. We look at the main tower of the castle, the donjon, or keep, as a single building, but this is a mistake. To understand how they survived in it, we need to see it not as a house, but as a vertical village, a small town stretching up to the sky. Each of its floors was a separate world with its own microclimate, functions, and social status, and altogether they created a single ecosystem of heat and resources, operating according to the laws of physics and strict hierarchy. Survival in the donjon was based on a strict hierarchy of heat. On the lowest level, often semi-basement and devoid of windows, were the storehouses. Here, in the coolness and darkness, strategic supplies were stored: grain in stalls, barrels of wine and ale, salted meat and fish, dried vegetables. This floor was the coldest but stable. The solid walls and the earth around it created a cellar effect, where the temperature was kept at +5 to all year round. It was an ideal place to store supplies, the foundation for the survival of any besieged fortress. There was also often a well, the main source of drinking water, protected from poisoning by the enemy. The floor above, on the ground level with narrow windows, often contained the kitchen and rooms for servants and garrison. This was the furnace and engine room of the entire castle. Huge hearths, ovens for baking bread, cauldrons for brewing beer worked almost around the clock. They not only cooked food for dozens or even hundreds of people, but also generated a huge amount of heat. The stone floors and vaulted ceilings heated up and slowly released that heat upward. It was noisy, crowded, smoky, and smelled of food, but it was relatively warm. It was the world of the common people who were at the very source of the castle's power. Above the kitchen was the Great Hall, the heart of the social, political, and judicial life of the castle. The heat from the lower floors came up here. The early Norman donjons had their own central hearth, the smoke from which escaped through a special hole in the roof, lucarna. Later, more efficient wall fireplaces with chimneys appeared, which was a real technological revolution that allowed to build full-fledged living floors above the hall without the risk of suffocation. It was here that all the inhabitants gathered for meals, the lord held court, received vassals, and entertained. But even this hall was not a single space. The heat was unevenly distributed. By the fire, on a dais, at the main table sat the lord, his family, and the most noble guests. Further along the walls at long tables sat the knights and squires. On the periphery, in the cold areas near the walls and in the drafts, were the servants. Social status determined your distance from the fire and therefore your comfort level. After dinner, the servants often slept right there on the floor, spreading their bunks close to the dying hearth. But at the very top, above the noisy and crowded hall, was the solar, the private quarters of the lord and his family. It was the warmest, quietest, most private, and safest place in the entire castle. A paradox? Not at all. It's pure physics. All the warm air from the kitchen, from the main hall, from hundreds of human bodies and dozens of torches, rose up and accumulated under the roof of the donjon. The floor of the solar was the ceiling of the main hall, and it was always warm. Here were the smallest windows, which could easily be draped with heavy curtains or even closed with wooden shutters. It had its own separate and more compact fireplace. The walls were hung with tapestries, which served not only as decoration, but also as additional insulation. It was a medieval penthouse, a symbol of power and luxury expressed primarily in warmth and privacy. This vertical stratification was key to efficient energy use. Heat was not lost. It migrated from the bottom to the top, serving the needs of different social groups. The servants and soldiers at the bottom generated heat through their labor and their very existence, while the lord and his family at the top consumed it in concentrated form. It was a cruel but ingeniously simple and effective system. When we see a castle, we have to imagine this continuous flow of heat rising from the bowels to the very top, and people living on its different temperature levels. It was not just architecture, but elaborate social and thermal engineering, where every stone and every person was part of a single survival mechanism. It's a subject not usually talked about in romantic stories about knights and fair ladies, but it is the key to understanding the genius and brutal pragmatism of medieval engineers. We are talking about toilets, or garderobes. Garderobes. For us, it is synonymous with unsanitary and uncomfortable. For them, one of the wittiest engineering solutions, a multitasking device that solves several pressing problems at once: hygiene, defense, household chemistry, and psychological intimidation. The mystery of the closet is in its construction. It was not just a hole in the floor. Most often, it was a small room or niche protruding from the main wall of the castle on powerful stone brackets. Inside is a stone or wooden seat with a hole in it, and beneath it is a vertical shaft leading down to the base of the wall. This clever design solved a major problem: the removal of waste outside the living space. Odor and sewage were not accumulated indoors, which was critical to preventing disease in the crowded environment of the castle, but were discharged outdoors. The cold draft traveling down the shaft served as a primitive but effective exhaust system. But the devil, as always, is in the details. Why closet? The name comes from a French word meaning to store clothes. There is a convincing theory that lords and ladies hung their expensive furs and woolen garments in these niches, which were constantly drafty and soaked in ammonia vapors. Ammonia, found in high concentrations in urine, is a natural insecticide that effectively kills bed lice, fleas, and moths. Thus, the toilet served as a dry cleaning and disinfestation closet at the same time. It was multitasking in action. While you were taking a dump, your expensive clothes, a status symbol, were being sanitized, protecting them from the vermin that were the real scourge of the Middle Ages. The second and more important function is defensive. Engineers turned a vulnerable place into an element of fortification. The closet shafts were narrow, vertical, and with smooth stone walls. It was almost impossible to climb up them to get into the castle. They often came out at high altitude, over a deep water moat or a steep rocky slope, which made access to them even more difficult. In some castles, such as the Norman Castle at Carlisle, the mine openings were cleverly built into the buttresses, vertical ledges reinforcing the wall, making them even less visible and accessible to attackers. But the most striking thing is the active use of closets during a siege. Imagine an army storming a castle. The soldiers, breathing heavily, are climbing ladders or trying to break the wall with a battering ram at the base, and streams of filth pour out of these seemingly harmless holes right onto their heads. It was not only humiliating and demoralizing. Such yellow rain undermined morale. It was deadly. In an era without antibiotics, human excrement was a veritable biological weapon. They were teeming with bacteria that caused dysentery, typhoid, and tetanus. If such a substance got into an open wound, it was almost guaranteed to lead to gangrene, blood poisoning, and agonizing death. The defenders of the castle were essentially engaged in primitive but highly effective biological warfare. The slippery mass at the foot of the wall also hindered ladders and siege towers. At Dover Castle, a key fortress on the coast of England, you can see whole batteries of closets serving the barracks. This shows how massive and thoughtful this decision was. And what happened to the waste below? They were either washed away by the current of the ditch or, at certain times, had to be cleaned out. This was done by gong farmers, one of the dirtiest and most dangerous but well-paid professions. At night, they scooped out the contents of the cesspools and sold them to farmers as valuable fertilizer. Their work entailed the risk of suffocation from the poisonous gases that accumulated in the confined space. Thus, the medieval closet is not a sign of savagery, but a symbol of sophisticated, multi-layered thinking. It is a system that ingeniously combined hygiene, clothing storage, fortification, psychological and biological warfare. It's a mystery that forces us to look at the most messy aspects of medieval life as part of an elaborate and ruthless survival strategy. The main enemy of the English castle was not fire or the enemy army, it was water. The ubiquitous, pervasive English damp, endless rain, thick fogs, treacherous groundwater. The water eroded the foundations, washed away the mortar between the stones, turned the supply cellars into stinking swamps, and gave rise to mold and disease. Fighting it was an invisible but merciless and constant war, and it was won by complex and ingenious hydraulic engineering, much of which is hidden from our eyes. We look at the moat around the castle and see only a barrier to the enemy, but that's only half the truth. The ditch, especially in lowland and marshy areas, was an essential element of the drainage system. It worked as a giant collector, collecting excess groundwater and rainwater, preventing it from accumulating under the foundation and weakening it, which could lead to the subsidence and collapse of massive walls. Castle construction often began precisely with the creation of a complex system of canals and drains that diverted water away from the construction site. Kenilworth Castle, for example, was surrounded by a whole system of artificial lakes, sluices, and dams that were not only an impressive element of defense, but also a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, regulating the water level over a vast area and keeping the mill running. The foundation was another hidden mystery. It didn't just go into the ground. The builders created a layered pie of stability and drainage under the walls. They dug a deep pit, much wider than the future wall, and filled it with layers of compacted gravel, sand, and crushed stone. This layer worked as a giant filter and drain, preventing capillary moisture from the soil from rising up the walls, a phenomenon that still destroys ancient buildings today. Sometimes a layer of impermeable material, such as shale, was placed at the base of the masonry, creating a primitive but effective waterproofing barrier. The walls themselves at the base were often made with a noticeable slope outward, the so-called scarp or slope. This not only increased their strength and resistance to digging and ramming, but also forced rainwater running down the walls to be diverted as far away from the vulnerable foundation as possible. Inside the castle itself, there was a whole network of invisible communications. The floors of the courtyards, which appear flat to us, had subtle slopes that directed rainwater to special drainage grates. From there, stone or ceramic pipes laid underground carried the water outside the walls, into the moat, or into a special prefabricated tank, a cistern. You will never see large puddles in the courtyard of a well-designed castle. The whole system was designed to get rid of water as quickly and efficiently as possible. Even the roofs of towers and buildings were part of this defense system against water. They were covered with durable and expensive lead sheets, slate or ceramic tiles, laid with large overlaps. Stone gutters ran along the edges of the roofs, which often ended in the famous gargoyles. We consider them merely grotesque decorations, but their main function was purely utilitarian. They served as drain pipes, diverting powerful streams of water as far away from the surface of the walls as possible. This prevented erosion of the lime mortar in the joints of the masonry and wetting of the upper layers of stone. And of course, the source of life, the well. Its defense was of paramount importance. Ideally, the well was located inside the donjon to provide water for the defenders, even if the enemy captured the courtyard. Wells were driven dozens of meters deep through the rock, which was a Herculean effort. If a well was impossible, underground cisterns lined with waterproof mortar were created to collect rainwater. Most strikingly, all these complex engineering solutions were created without precise drawings, laser levels, or computer modeling. They were the result of centuries of experience passed down from master to apprentice, intuition, and a deep understanding of how water, earth, and stone behave. Castle builders were not just masons, they were outstanding hydraulic engineers. They realized that a castle that lost the war on water was doomed, even if it was never touched by an enemy's foot. This invisible battle for dryness was one of the most important for survival. Imagine being plunged into almost total darkness for 6 months. The day is reduced to a few hours of gray, dim light that barely shines through the narrow, blade-like slits in the windows. The rest of the time is a thick, viscous gloom, dispersed only by the flickering flame of a tallow candle or a smoldering, smoking torch. This was the sensory reality of an English winter in a castle. And survival under these conditions was not only physical, but also deeply psychological. It was necessary not only to keep warm, but also not to lose one's mind in the endless darkness. The mystery is how they used what little light they had. The battlement's windows were not mere holes in the wall, but precise optical instruments. Their location and shape were the result of intricate calculation. They almost always had slopes, embrasures, that extended strongly inward. This funnel shape allowed the narrow outer opening, for protection against arrows, to collect daylight and disperse it over the widest possible area inside the room. The architects seemed to catch each precious photon and stretch it, making it illuminate as much space as possible. In addition, the location of windows was strictly related to the movement of the sun in social hierarchy. The windows in the chapel were almost always oriented to the east, so that the first rays of the morning sun would fall on the altar during Mass. This had not only a sacred, but also a practical meaning. It was a natural bell, signaling the beginning of a new day, starting the rhythm of life in the entire castle. The windows in the Lord's living quarters, the salar, tended to be placed on the south or west side to catch the maximum of daylight and solar heat. But the northern walls, the coldest and darkest, were often left blank or with as few openings as possible. But the real magic they achieved was by manipulating artificial light and reflections. In a world where real candle wax was incredibly expensive, it was produced by bees, burned cleanly, brightly and smelled good, and was available mainly to the church and high nobility. And most people were content with cheap tallow candles made from animal fat that smoked, smelled, and gave off a dim light. Every light source was worth its weight in gold. To enhance it, any reflective surface was used. Polished pewter or silver plates, steel shields, even sword blades hung on the wall were placed behind the candle, and they worked as primitive reflectors, doubling the amount of light. Even the bright tapestries with gold and silver threads woven in not only showed off the richness, but also gently reflected the light of the fire, creating a warm, shimmering glow and coziness in the room. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a tangible, hostile presence. It concealed real dangers, an uneven floor, a sudden step that could break a leg. It pressed on the psyche, causing what we would today call seasonal affective disorder, depression, and irrational fears. So even the smallest light sources had great symbolic and practical significance. Carnarvon Castle, one of Edward the Fern's greatest fortresses, has elaborate interior corridors in the thickness of the walls, illuminated only by narrow shafts of light running through the entire masonry. This was so that the guards could move around without using torches that would give away their location to the enemy. Controlling light was a way of structuring time, space, and life itself. Morning light from the chapel's east window is rising and prayer. Bright daylight, time to work. The evening fire in the main hearth is a time for dining, socializing, storytelling, and ballad singing. Nighttime, almost absolute darkness, a time of sleep, fear of the supernatural, and danger. Life was inextricably subordinated to this natural light cycle. The ability to find, preserve, and increase light was not just a household trick, but a key psychological survival skill to maintain order, sanity, and hope in the heart of months of darkness. Every castle has a heart, and it's not a throne room or a lord's bedroom. It's a well, a source of water without which the most impregnable fortress would fall in a matter of days. We take it for granted, but in medieval times, creating and protecting a well was the pinnacle of engineering and a constant headache. The mystery of the well begins with its location. It was almost always placed inside the donjon or in the central, most protected courtyard. This made it invulnerable to the besiegers. The enemy could neither poison the water nor cut off access to it. But this meant that it had to be dug through dozens of meters of solid rock. At Beeston Castle in Cheshire, the well goes 113 meters deep into the rock. Imagine this titanic labor, people working by the light of greasy stoves, by hand, with picks and shovels, breaking through the rock year after year. This was one of the most difficult and expensive phases of construction. But digging a well was half the battle. The water had to be kept clean. A stone or wooden blockhouse was always built around the wellhead to keep dirt from the surface inside. A canopy or even a whole tower was often built over it to protect it from rain and falling debris. The very mechanism for lifting water, a gate with a chain or rope, was a valuable asset. The castle property inventories often separately indicate one chain for a well with 2 buckets. Water from the well was a strategic resource. It was used not only for drinking and cooking, but also to put out fires, one of the main threats to the castle's internal wooden buildings. Some castles, like the Tower of London, had several wells to provide a backup water supply. But the well was not only a source of life, it was also a place steeped in superstition. It was a portal to the underworld, to uncharted depths. It was believed to be haunted by spirits. Throwing coins into the well is an echo of ancient rituals of tribute to these spirits. Archaeologists often find not only buckets and trash at the bottom of old wells, but also personal items such as rings, knives, and buckles that may have been both accidentally lost and sacrificed. The biggest mystery of the well is how it was found. In the absence of geological survey, the builders relied on experience, omens, and perhaps vine walkers, people who claimed to be able to find water with a split branch. The choice of location for a castle often depended on whether a well could be dug there. A mistake cost a fortune and could render the entire castle useless. The well was the silent center of life and death. It was the bustle of the day, maids with buckets, cooks, soldiers. But at night it became a dark, bottomless eye, staring into the sky from the heart of the castle. Its depth and coldness were a reminder of the fragility of life, totally dependent on this thin channel linking their world to the underground waters. The castle's survival began and ended here, in its dark and cold heart. The fireplace in the Lord's Hall was the official center of heat, a symbol of power. But for hundreds of other castle dwellers, there was a whole hidden economy of heat based on ingenuity and the ability to utilize the byproducts of life. The main unofficial power stations were the kitchen and the forge, huge kitchen hearths where something was constantly boiling and frying, radiated heat around the clock. The wall adjacent to the kitchen was always warm, and the space next to it was a valuable resource. The kitchen servants may have lived in the chill, but they were rarely cold. The same was true of the forge. The crucible, heated for forging weapons and tools, was another source of intense heat. Roasters, portable metal or ceramic bowls with smoldering coals, were used to heat individual points. This was a dangerous technology. The coals for the brazier were first ignited outside or in a large hearth to burn off the carbon monoxide, and only then, as a smoldering mass, were brought into the room. They were placed under the table to warm the feet, or even brought into bed before going to sleep to warm the feather bed. Owning a brazier and knowing how to handle it was a vital skill. When external sources of heat were not enough, the human body itself became the main furnace, and food was the fuel for this furnace. The winter diet in the castle is not about refinements, but about calories and thermogenesis. The basis of the diet was not soup, but pottage. A thick brew of grain, oats, barley, beans, and any available vegetables. All the leftovers, bones, meat scraps went into this pot. It could be cooked over low heat for several days, constantly replenished. The main source of energy was fat, lard, bone marrow. It was added to porridge and used to butter bread. Fat is a slow-burning fuel that gives maximum energy to maintain body temperature. Spices played an important role. According to the medieval humoral theory, all foods were divided into hot, cold, dry, and wet. In winter, in order to resist external cold and dampness, one should eat hot food. Pepper, ginger, cloves, mustard, and garlic were considered powerful hot agents. They were added to food and drink, e.g. hot wine with spices, not so much for flavor as a medicine to get the blood flowing and warm the body from the inside. We are used to visualizing a castle, but to understand how it was lived in, it must be heard. Sound was a crucial system of navigation and security. The castle was not a quiet place, and its soundscape was full of meaning. The main tuning fork was the bell of the castle chapel. It rang the canonical clock, regulating the entire daily routine, rising, praying, working, eating, and going to bed. It was a clock for everyone. The rhythmic clanging of the hammer in the forge was not noise, but the sound of life, a sign that tools and weapons were being repaired, that the castle was functioning. The shout of a guard on the wall echoing from a post on another tower was more than routine. At night, those voices, echoing in the darkness, were a sound barrier, confirming that the perimeter was secure, that the castle was awake. They were soothing and allowed one to sleep peacefully. The mooing of cattle and bleating of sheep in the courtyard were the sound of prosperity and food security. Any unfamiliar or inappropriate sound, the crack of a branch behind a wall, the quiet scraping of metal, was an instant alarm. The inhabitants of the castle were natural listeners. Their ears were as important a survival tool as their eyes. This sound code created a sense of order and predictability, protecting the psyche from the chaos of the outside world and the oppressive silence of a long winter night. We walked through the secret corridors of English castles, looked into their dark corners, and tried to solve the riddle of survival of their inhabitants. And now it becomes clear. A castle is not just a fortress of stone. It is a complex mechanism, an ingenious machine for life, created on the edge of human capabilities. Survival in it was not passive suffering, but an active, creative, and intellectual process. It was a daily game of chess with cold, damp, disease, and gloom. Breathable walls that fought mold. The alchemy of herbs that conquered stench and contagion. A vertical hierarchy of heat that turned the donjon into a living ecosystem. Defensive toilets, ingenious drainage systems, the psychology of light, and the Herculean labor of creating wells. The real mystery of a medieval castle is not how people managed not to die in it. The real mystery of a medieval castle is not how people managed not to die in it, but how sophisticated, thoughtful, and elegant their way of living was. This is a story not of weakness before the elements, but of the triumph of human intelligence. If you want to continue to tear the covers off the mysteries of the past and learn history, not from textbooks, but through sensations, smells, and invisible details, subscribe to our channel. After all, the greatest discoveries await us where, it would seem, everything has long been known, inside the silent walls that still keep their secrets.